If you have been podcasting for any amount of time, you know that it takes a lot of heart and a lot of excitement to continue to podcast on an ongoing basis. But how do you know when it's time to throw in the towel to say, I don't know if this direction of a podcast is for me, or I don't know if I should be podcasting at all? That's the question that we're going to be answering today. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Successful Podcasting Unlocked. I am your host, Alicia Galati. I'm the founder of Galati Media, a full-service podcast management agency where we help business owners launch and maintain lead-generating shows. Today's question is, how do I know if it's time to stop podcasting? This is something that I get asked so often, and I see people feeling so much shame and remorse and frustration around themselves and the industry when it comes to deciding to stop podcasting. If you've heard me talk on the podcast before, you know this stat, but if you're new here, this stat is probably going to blow your mind if you are a podcaster or considering podcasting. And that stat is 90% of podcasters don't make it to 25 episodes. That is a lot. That is a huge percentage of podcasts out there that just stop podcasting once they reach 25 episodes. We call this the pod fade rate. And if you look at those who have reached 100 episodes, it's a less than 5% that actually end up reaching 100 episodes, and then it's less than 3% that reach 200 episodes. So your likelihood of going from 100 to 200 is better than your likelihood of going from no podcast episodes to 25 episodes. But there shouldn't be any shame around deciding that a podcast is no longer right for you. And I want to expel that. I want to push it off to the side. You can still love podcasting, love it as a way to show up and say, oh, this podcast is no longer serving me. But how do you know that? How do you know that you need to let a podcast go, maybe pick up a different one, or stop altogether? The first thing that you're going to want to do is make sure that you have been clear, and also make sure that you have been real with yourself, honest with yourself about your podcast goals. We've talked about podcast goals, setting them, creating intentions. We'll make sure that we link that in the show notes, but make sure that when you are coming up with podcast goals, when you are being very clear and intentional about your podcast goals, that you actually put in the effort to accomplish that. So if your goal is to use your podcast to generate leads for your business, then what did you do for the course of at least 6 months to do that with your podcast? Were you tracking that information? Were you really giving the podcast your all, or was it touch and go? Were you consistent with your podcast? These are all things that you have to be really honest with yourself about when you come to a decision of, am I going to stop podcasting or should I just keep going? If you are having a life situation, and we've talked about this in our capacity episode, and deciding on a podcast frequency, trying to decide, okay, I want to have a weekly show or I want to have a bi-weekly show. What does that look like for me? How do I decide what works for me? And sometimes that's a learning curve. Sometimes that is you start it every week and then you kind of have to dial it back and say, oh man, this did not work at all. This did not work out how I thought it was going to be. And I'm going to have to not keep doing it at this speed because life, whatever, situations, everything happens that you might have to put the podcast on a pause. Then you can decide, does this need to look like a seasonal podcast or should this be ongoing? Is this something that I can realistically keep doing? And if so, can I keep my love of the podcast alive between seasons or if I keep going? So this is something that you're also going to have to consider is this just a pause for now or do I need to let this go? I feel like the answer to this question, as we've kind of talked through these things, it depends, which I tend to say a lot. When people ask me questions, it depends. It depends on how much effort you're putting into your podcast. It depends on what your life looks like. Realistically, like being, and I keep saying this, but I think it's so important, being honest with yourself. Are you doing this podcast because it lights you up? Are you doing this podcast because you know that it can make a difference in people's lives? Or are you doing your podcast because someone told you you should have a podcast? Does the market even need your podcast? And I'm not saying that to say, let imposter syndrome come in and stop you from doing the thing. It's how can you set yourself apart instead of just regurgitating the same thing that everyone else is saying? How can you show up differently for your audience, for your listeners? And yes, that might mean that you lose listeners. Yes, that might mean that you might have fewer listeners than the next person, but they're going to be the right listeners. So if you're considering, is a podcast right for me right now? Is this something that I even should be going forward with? I want you to consider all of these things that we've mentioned. So the first being, what are your goals? Second, did you give it your all? Number 3, were you being too broad with your topic? Number 4, are you even excited about the content? And number 5, trust yourself. I didn't say this one, but really trust yourself. If you are feeling overwhelmed and frustrated and kind of at a breaking point in your podcast, trust that. Trust that feeling. You don't need to hire somebody to tell you. You don't need to explain it to anyone. Trust that you know what is best for you. You know what is best moving forward in your business, in creating regular content. And maybe that looks like being on other people's podcasts. Maybe that means you are speaking on panels, going to events, interacting with people in different ways. We get to decide what our business looks like. We get to decide what type of content we are coming up with regularly. And if a podcast feels really hard, then you should assess and be honest with yourself of, is this the right thing for me right now? Is this going to be the right thing for me in 6 months? You're the only one that can make that decision. And I know that you're going to make the right one, because if you're trusting yourself and you're looking at all of those things we talked about, then I know that you will make the decision that is going to be right for you. If you have any podcasting questions, please feel free to reach out. Go to successfulpodcastingunlocked.com. You can submit your questions there, or you can always send me a DM on Instagram at successful.podcasting.unlocked, or find me at alicia.galati. I am more than happy to answer your questions. I will answer them in the DMs, but I will also take those questions and I will use them for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening. And again, happy podcasting.